from 28 months to 120 months. She, in November of this year, she will have done 2 years, 24 months.
24 months. It's incredible. 24 months for an attorney who is the people's attorney and was only doing her job. In reference to the appeal and Lynne and the fact that there still is no date for argument, Lynne wrote to us and alerted us of the recent decision of the 11th Circuit Court in Atlanta. This is the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, in which they considered an appeal by both Jose Padilla's attorneys for the case in Florida and also the district attorneys in that case about whether or not there was a conviction for Padilla and his co-defendants, and whether or not the sentence was appropriate. And the three-judge panel of this 11th Circuit two of them came, and consequently a majority of the two, came down with a ruling that just as in Lynne's case, that the sentence of the judge in the case was not sufficient. They said the sentence was substantively unreasonable and that there should be a much larger sentence than what the judge had handed down. And the judge had already handed down a 17-year prison sentence, imposing that on Jose Padilla for a vacuous case, and yet this 11th Circuit said that this did not meet the federal sentencing guides for terrorism cases.
Well, I want to comment on that.
Does not bode well for her own appeal.
We should alert our listeners to some basic issues pertaining to the case of Jose Padilla and the ominous implications of a decision by an appellate court that 17 years is not sufficient. Jose Padilla was kidnapped by the U.S. government and held in isolation on a ship where he was subjected for 2 years of total sensory deprivation, where he could no longer distinguish what was an outside noise and what was coming from inside his head, where he's literally driven mad with constant bombardment of images and messages that were designed to derange him, and did indeed. He couldn't tell when he was being spoken to by a person in his presence or from the messages that were being put through ear devices into his head, day and night, deprived of sunlight, day and night in total darkness, day and night in total isolation, until he was no longer able to tell what was real and what was not. That was the condition in which he was maintained. That was the torture to which he was subjected, a fiendish torture, in which they literally destroyed the man's mind. When he was talking to his attorneys, he didn't know if they were in front of him, and he was convinced that they were part of the government torture of him.
Ralph, we should point out that this took place in a North Carolina brig, and yet the conditions of Jose Padilla in the brig were not allowed into the Florida case. In fact, the entire capture of Jose Padilla, ostensibly for the dirty bomb, was that this was dropped. He was never tried on that. He was tried along with two others for supposed conspiracy to murder people on foreign soil. To go to the sentence and what relates to Lynne's case, the circuit courts and what the appellate court in Lynne's case are saying is that the judge imposing a sentence in a case no longer has the discretion that historically has been allocated to judges in criminal case. In other words, the appellate courts are taking upon themselves the right to sentence prisoners. This is a vast change in the U.S. judicial system.
But it has another fundamental implication that is quite analogous to the way in which Lynne Stewart has been demonized and subject to what is basically the architecture of the fascist state. the orchestrated claims and charges against Padilla that he was involved in plotting the release in the United States of what is called a dirty bomb, for which there was never a scintilla of evidence, was completely dropped. They never attempted to provide any evidence that could sustain this claim, and in fact they shifted it to his presumptive conversations on the telephone with people he knew in Cairo about his sympathy for the Islamic movement. But even in those conversations, he never made any direct reference nor in any way communicated anything about aid for armed action, aimed for actions against individuals. It was strictly an expression of his religious convictions, no political content whatsoever. That was the shift to which the government made, because they couldn't produce any evidence in trial for the dirty bomb charge. So for literally 2 years, the media had blanketed the world with the claims that this man had been was being held for his involvement in a plot to release a dirty bomb. Then in the actual trial, none of that is produced, and the so-called evidence has to do with phone calls to people that he knew that had no bearing on anything in Afghanistan, no bearing in regard to any of the conflicts of the United States specifically or politically. This is a man who, when he was being defended in a court, his lawyers, as you mentioned, were not allowed to inform the jury of what I'm just describing, let alone the torture to which he was subjected. This was not permitted into the courtroom. And then a sentence on this basis is handed down for 17 years. And to give you the flavor, the jurors dressed up in an American flag in the first 2 rows, given the drumbeat of propaganda from the state. In this charade, this Alice in Wonderland charade, a sentence of 17 years was handed down to this innocent, tormented man, and this appellate court rules that that's not enough? And Lynne Stewart has been convicted of defending a man equally innocent of the charges that were in fact of government origin, the so-called Landmarks plot and the so-called claim of plotting to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. They didn't produce a scintilla of evidence to associate Sheikh Abdul Rahman with those charges. They couldn't. There is none except for the role of government informers who actually prepared the operation for the FBI and for Egyptian intelligence. The Padilla case is a paradigm of the charade that goes by the name of the court system in this arbitrary sentencing of Lynne, assimilating her to the charge of her client who was innocent of the charge in the first place.
The only comparison to Padilla with Lynne Stewart is that they are both used to frighten the American people with the boogeyman of terrorism. And Lynne's crime is not only did she defend the blind sheikh in a successful manner, she also showed that the American government were the guilty ones in this so-called conspiracy to blow up New York City landmarks. So Lynne is guilty of a double crime, being too proactive in working for her client and being successful, and also showing the government complicity in this, like I say, raising of the boogeyman to frighten the American people into compliance. But one of the differences in then and now is the American people have seen what has happened when they go for this boogeyman terrorism and they lose their homes, their jobs. That which was considered to be justice, that is gone. They lose privacy, and now this is where we are. So there is the difference, and we hope that that difference is waking people up to what is the real problem here. It is not the boogeyman of terrorism. It is the reality of the American injustice system.